Deacon Sharp was forced into an impossible decision, one that would test the limits of his love, his morality, and his very soul. It all began when Sheila Carter, ever the master manipulator, set into motion a plan so chilling, so calculated, that even those who thought they knew her darkest sides were left shaken. Taylor Hayes had unknowingly walked straight into Sheila's trap, lured under the guise of a fragile truce that never truly existed. Hidden away in a dim, isolated room, Taylor's life hung by a thread, and Sheila made sure Deacon was the only one who could save her, but at a devastating cost. The demand was simple in words, yet catastrophic in consequence. Sign over Il Giardino, the restaurant that symbolized Deacon's redemption and second chance, or watch Taylor die. Deacon's world collapsed in that moment. Il Giardino wasn't just a business. It was his lifeline, his proof that he had changed, that he was no longer the reckless man who once made destructive choices. Every plate served, every customer welcomed, every quiet night closing up shop had been a step toward becoming someone better. And now Sheila wanted it all. Not for survival, not for necessity, but for power, for control, for the twisted satisfaction of bending Deacon to her will. As Sheila's cold voice echoed through the phone, describing Taylor's precarious situation in chilling detail, Deacon felt a familiar dread creep in. He knew Sheila was capable of anything. He had seen it. He had lived it. And worst of all, part of him still felt tied to her in ways he hated to admit. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about Taylor, about saving a life that meant so much to so many, especially to her children and the fragile peace she had fought so hard to build. Deacon's mind raced, torn between the life he had rebuilt and the life he could save. Memories flooded in, his past mistakes, his regrets, the times he had chosen wrong. This time had to be different. This time, someone else's life depended on it. Yet the cost felt unbearable. Signing over Il Giardino meant surrendering everything he had worked for, handing it to the very person who had caused so much pain and chaos in his life. It meant empowering Sheila in a way that could have ripple effects far beyond this single moment. Meanwhile, Sheila watched it all unfold with unnerving calm. To her, this was a game of strategy, a test of how far she could push Deacon, how much she could take before he broke. She justified her actions in her own twisted logic, convincing herself that she deserved Il Giardino, that Deacon owed her, that everything she was doing was somehow warranted. But beneath that delusion was a darker truth. Sheila thrived on control, on fear, on the ability to make others suffer for her gain. And in that moment, she held all the cards. Deacon arrived at the location Sheila specified, his hands trembling not from fear alone but from the weight of the decision he had already begun to accept. He saw Taylor, weak but alive, and his heart nearly shattered at the sight. She met his eyes with a mixture of confusion and concern, unaware of the deal being forced behind the scenes. Sheila stepped forward, her expression unreadable, and presented the documents. There it was in black and white, the transfer of ownership, the complete surrender of Il Giardino. All Deacon had to do was sign. All he had to do was give up everything. The silence in the room was suffocating. Deacon hesitated, his pen hovering over the paper as his thoughts screamed at him to find another way. But there was no other way. Sheila had ensured that. Every second he delayed was another second Taylor's life remained in danger. Finally, with a heavy breath and a heart full of anguish, Deacon signed. The moment the pen left the paper, it felt as though something inside him had broken. Sheila's lips curled into a satisfied smile as she took the documents, her victory complete. True to her word, at least for now, Sheila released Taylor. The tension in the room shifted instantly as Deacon rushed to her side, helping her to safety, his relief overshadowed only by the crushing reality of what he had just lost. Taylor, still trying to piece together what had happened, could see the devastation in Deacon's eyes. She didn't yet know the full extent of his sacrifice, but she knew it was something profound, something that would change everything. As the dust settled, the consequences of that night began to ripple outward. Il Giardino was no longer Deacon's. It was Sheila's domain now, a chilling thought for anyone who understood what she was capable of. Deacon was left to grapple with the aftermath, questioning whether he had done the right thing, even as he knew deep down that he couldn't have made any other choice. Saving Taylor had come at a cost he might never recover from. And Sheila? She walked away victorious, at least on the surface. But in the world of the bold and the beautiful, victories are rarely as simple as they seem. Because while she may have gained Il Giardino, she had also set into motion a chain of events that could come back to haunt her in ways she never anticipated. Deacon's sacrifice would not be forgotten, and Taylor's survival would undoubtedly lead to new alliances, new conflicts, and perhaps even a reckoning for Sheila Carter that had been a long time coming. The aftermath of that devastating exchange rippled through the lives of everyone connected to the bold and the beautiful, but for Deacon Sharp, the fallout was immediate and suffocating, like a storm that refused to pass. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly, couldn't even bring himself to step near Il Giardino without feeling the crushing weight of what it now represented. Not hope, not redemption, but loss, manipulation, and the lingering presence of Sheila Carter looming over everything he once built. And even though he had saved Taylor Hayes, the victory felt hollow, almost poisoned by the cost he had paid, because every memory tied to the restaurant now belonged to Sheila, twisted into something darker, something dangerous. And the worst part was knowing that Sheila would not stop here. She never did, she never could, because control was her lifeblood, and now she had a new stage to play her games, a new symbol of power that she had stolen through fear and coercion. And as Deacon sat alone, replaying the moment he signed those papers over and over again, he realized that this wasn't the end of Sheila's scheme. It was only the beginning. Meanwhile, Taylor struggled to come to terms with what had been done in her name, because when she finally learned the truth, that Deacon had given up everything to save her life, she was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of guilt and disbelief, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer, her heart aching at the realization that someone had sacrificed so much for her survival. And yet she couldn't ignore the lingering fear that Sheila had orchestrated this not just to gain Il Giardino, but to set them all against each other in a way that would unravel whatever fragile stability they had managed to build. And Taylor, ever the compassionate and introspective presence, found herself caught in a painful internal conflict, torn between gratitude for Deacon's selfless act and anger that he had been forced into such a decision in the first place, because no one should have that kind of power over another human being. No one should be able to manipulate life and death like pieces on a chessboard. And yet Sheila had done exactly that, proving once again that she was as dangerous as ever. As word began to spread, reactions poured in from every corner of their intertwined lives, and none were more explosive than those from Steffi Forrester, who could barely contain her fury when she discovered what Sheila had done, her protective instincts for her mother igniting into a blazing determination to make Sheila pay for crossing a line that should never have been crossed. And Steffi's anger wasn't just about the kidnapping or the threat, it was about the sheer audacity of Sheila. Believing she could once again terrorize their family and walk away unscathed, and this time, Steffi wasn't willing to let fear dictate their response, because she had seen what happened when Sheila was allowed to operate unchecked. She had lived through the consequences, and she refused to let history repeat itself, not when her mother's life had been on the line, not when Deacon had been pushed to the brink of losing everything. Sheila, however, remained eerily composed, almost serene in her newfound ownership of Il Giardino, as if she had simply acquired what was rightfully hers all along, and she wasted no time making her presence known, stepping into the restaurant not as a guest, not as a partner, but as the undisputed owner, her eyes scanning every detail with a sense of satisfaction that bordered on obsession, because to Sheila, this wasn't just about business, it was about legacy, about carving out a space in the world where she held absolute control, where no one could take anything from her again. And yet beneath that confidence was a subtle tension, a flicker of awareness that she had pushed things further than ever before, that this act might not be so easily buried or forgiven. But Sheila had never been one to dwell on consequences, not when she was so close to having everything she wanted. Deacon eventually found the strength to confront her, the air between them thick with unresolved emotions and unspoken truths, and when he looked at Sheila standing behind the counter of Il Giardino, It felt surreal, almost like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from, because this place had been his sanctuary, his proof that he could change, and now it had become a symbol of everything he had lost to her manipulation. And yet, despite the anger burning inside him, there was also a strange sense of clarity, because for the first time, Deacon saw Sheila not through the lens of their complicated past, not through lingering feelings or shared history, but for exactly who she was. A woman willing to destroy lives to get what she wanted. A woman who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And as he stood there, facing her, he realized that whatever connection they once had was gone, replaced by something far colder, far more final. But Sheila, ever perceptive, sensed that shift immediately, and while she tried to mask it with her usual confidence, there was a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible moment, where something flickered in her expression, something that hinted at the possibility that she might lose Deacon completely this time, and for all her manipulation, for all her schemes, that was something even Sheila couldn't fully control, because Deacon's sacrifice had changed him, had forced him to confront the reality of who Sheila truly was, and that realization was more dangerous to her than any external threat. As tensions escalated, alliances began to shift, with Taylor and Steffi growing closer in their shared determination to stop Sheila, while Deacon found himself in an unexpected position, caught between the life he had lost and the fight he now felt compelled to join, because even though he had given up Il Giardino to save Taylor, he couldn't ignore the growing threat Sheila posed, not just to them, but to everyone in their orbit. And the question looming over everything was no longer whether Sheila would strike again, but when and how far she was willing to go next. And in true the bold and the beautiful fashion, just as it seemed like the dust might begin to settle, a new twist began to take shape, one that threatened to upend everything once more, because whispers started to circulate that the transfer of Il Giardino might not be as airtight as Sheila believed, that there could be a loophole, a way to challenge what had been done under duress, and if that were true, it could change everything, not just for Deacon but for Sheila as well, because if there was one thing more dangerous than Sheila with power, it was Sheila with something to lose, and this time, she had more at stake than ever before. The possibility of a loophole became more than just a whisper. It grew into a fragile thread of hope that Deacon Sharp clung to with everything he had left, because if there was even the slightest chance that the transfer of Il Giardino could be reversed, then maybe, just maybe, this nightmare could be undone, and yet nothing in the world of the bold and the beautiful was ever that simple, especially when Sheila Carter was involved, because Sheila didn't just make moves, she anticipated consequences, she planned for retaliation, and she always made sure she had leverage, which meant that if Deacon was going to fight back, he would have to be smarter, more careful, and more relentless than ever before, and that realization marked a turning point in him, a shift from the man who had been cornered into surrender to someone who was ready to reclaim what had been taken, no matter the cost. It was Taylor Hayes who first encouraged him not to give up, even as she struggled with the guilt of knowing that his loss had been the price of her survival, because Taylor understood something fundamental about Deacon. He wasn't just a man who had made mistakes, he was a man who had fought to rise above them, and Il Giardino had been proof of that transformation, and she refused to let Sheila erase that progress without a fight, even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory once again. Even if it meant risking another confrontation with the woman who had nearly taken her life, because Taylor knew that backing down would only embolden Sheila further, and that was a risk none of them could afford to take. At the same time, Steffi Forrester began working behind the scenes with a fierce determination that mirrored her mother's resolve but carried an edge of calculated strategy, because Steffi wasn't just reacting, she was planning, analyzing every angle, every weakness, every possible way to dismantle Sheila's hold over Il Giardino and expose the truth about how it had been obtained, and the more she dug, the clearer it became that Sheila's victory might not be as secure as she believed, because coercion, threats, and manipulation had a way of leaving cracks, and those cracks could be widened into something that might finally bring Sheila down. But Sheila, ever watchful, began to sense the shift in the air, the subtle change in how people looked at her, the tension that followed her into every room, and while she maintained her composure, there was a growing intensity beneath the surface, a need to tighten her grip on everything she had gained, because she knew better than anyone that power taken through force could just as easily be taken back, and she wasn't about to let that happen. Not after everything she had done to secure it, not after everything she had risked. And so she began to make her own moves, reinforcing her position, reminding everyone, especially Deacon, that she was still in control, that she still held the upper hand, and that crossing her would come with consequences they might not be prepared to face. The tension finally reached a boiling point when Deacon confronted Sheila once again, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. No hesitation, no lingering attachment, no trace of the conflicted man she had once been able to manipulate, because he had nothing left to lose, and that made him more dangerous than ever. And as they stood face to face inside Il Giardino, the air thick with unspoken history and rising hostility, Deacon made it clear that he wasn't done, that he wouldn't accept what she had done as final, that he would fight to take back what was his, not just for himself, but for everything Il Giardino had represented. And for a brief moment, something flickered in Sheila's expression. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to it, something that suggested she understood the gravity of what he was saying, because if Deacon truly turned against her, if he truly committed to exposing her, then the foundation of everything she had built could start to crumble. And yet, true to form, Sheila didn't back down. Instead, she leaned into the confrontation, her voice calm but laced with a warning that sent a chill through the room, because she reminded Deacon of exactly what she was capable of how far she had already gone, and of what she might still be willing to do if pushed. And it was in that moment that the full weight of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a battle over a restaurant. This was a war of wills, a clash between two people whose lives had been intertwined in ways that were as complicated as they were destructive, and there was no easy way out, no simple resolution waiting on the horizon. Meanwhile, Taylor and Steffi prepared for the next step, knowing that whatever came next would require courage, precision, and a willingness to face the consequences head-on, because taking down Sheila wouldn't just be about reclaiming Il Giardino. It would be about finally breaking the cycle of fear and manipulation that had defined her presence in their lives for far too long. And as they stood together, united in purpose, there was a sense that something bigger was at stake, something that went beyond any single conflict or confrontation, something that could change everything if they succeeded, or destroy everything if they failed.